Good afternoon, everybody. I promised that the last two of this year's lectures from me would deal with a rather cradle-to-grave aspect of music. The start of the operation in this lecture is talking about mostly personal experiences to do with the finding of music in its raw state, that is, its manuscript or library state, and bringing it into a condition where it can be put in your hands or into a performer's hands, can be sold, can be shelved in a public library and made available to people. And then next month, with Emma Kirkby and Jacob Lindberg, what we'll do is carry on from that point of having the edited, printed, available, performable music through what the performer discovers has to be done, may be done, should not be done, and the general intricacies of, as it were, cooking up the meal from the recipe. So in these two territories, it does look a bit as though the first, today's topic, is very much the province of the librarian and the scholar and the musicologist, whereas the second looks like the exciting one, the teacher, the performer, the public, the limelight, and all the glamour. In fact, in an ideal world, I think the people in charge of stage one ought to also be involved in stage two, and vice versa. Otherwise, quite a lot of difficulties arise. And very often, when these activities are segregated, you discover the people who are most expert at each stage do not actually play together very well. Sometimes they don't even speak the same language. And you can have mystification on both sides. The sheer musicologist, if he or she is not a performer, may well be absolutely baffled by something that the music appears to demand, but which a performer can easily explain as being absolutely normal. And vice versa. A performer without some sense of historical background or the origins of the music that they've picked off the shelf and are looking at can sometimes jump to the wrong conclusions. You need a little bit of help, usually, not only with the setting that the music was created for and in, but also the niceties of its notation or the assumptions of the composer, even if it's not a composer from an earlier period of music. Even contemporary compositions, I know, can sometimes entirely mystify the performer when they're first presented and need a little bit of explanation. So I think that the crossover between those two categories should be encouraged. Traditionally, it's been a little bit discouraged by more the 19th century German division of the performing institute, you know, the conservatoire, where often people took a great pride in not reading a single book. And the university, the Musikwissenschaft, the musicology side, where very often those crusty old librarians and musicologists took a great pride in not being able to play the national anthem on any instrument. So it might sound to you as though the first stage, as I say, is rather dusty. The second stage is rather exciting. So I thought I would dip first of all into what I would consider some of the excitements of editing music, and some of the pitfalls and choices and some of the qualifications I would say a good edition of music should have, so that when you're perhaps faced with a choice of your favorite pieces in different edited versions, you know what questions to ask of them. Well, the prize excitement, of course, about editing is possibly bringing to light and bringing up for performance some music that would not otherwise have been known or ever heard. Let me play you a little of something that arrived in this format. You'll probably know the music, but you won't know the sound. You won't expect the sound that it's making. Here's a little bit of what you will easily recognize as a Bach prelude. This Bach prelude and after it a sample of a Bach fugue are actually the last pieces that Stravinsky wrote. They're not included in most lists of his works, and there's been a general conspiracy to deny that he ever did it. But anyway, when he was quite ill in 1969 and going in and out of hospital in Los Angeles, and can you just hold it a moment? Going in and out of hospital in Los Angeles and New York, he was adamant that one of the things he most wanted to make available to the musical public was what he called the bread of life. He every day played at the piano a prelude and fugue by Bach. And he said to Robert Kraft and others that the great shame was only keyboard players tended to be aware or have physical contact with this repertoire. It was mentioned, the well-tempered clavier, but not so often heard. He thought he could be doing a service in his very old age to the concert public by making orchestrated versions of this music available. He was old, and he was infirm, but still bright of mind. If you turn to the last page of your handout, this is not music that you have to practice and sing or play, but you'll see the sort of result of Stravinsky's slightly shaky pencil hand, Preludio 11 at the top, and this is laid out for strings in a sort of way. Most of the parts are there. He's taking them direct from his Czerny edition of the Bach 48. We'll come to that in a moment. And turning this prelude at least into a piece for strings. The surprise for me was finding that this music did exist. The manuscript had been carefully sorted away in the collection of all Stravinsky's music that was sold to the Paul Sacher Foundation in Basel, and there, lurking in a bottom drawer, was a folder that contained these shaky sheets with a few later red markings over them and clear indications that somebody had copied out performing parts from these pieces. In spite of that, the books either denied that they were done, or musicologists would say they were unfinished pieces, or Stravinsky was not in a fit enough state to say that this was real music. All the notes are there. You don't have to supply any more than Stravinsky has laid out on the page. You do sometimes have to clarify the notes that he's written, and certainly you have to work out which instrument is meant to be playing them. This is a string ensemble, and he's labeled it very nicely at the beginning, so you know what you're in for. You know roughly where the music is going, and sometimes when he gets himself lost, he gives you a little indicator. When it comes to a fugue, the editor can step in a little more, and that sonority you might have thought was fairly normal. It doesn't really require a Stravinsky to think of a string orchestra playing an orchestration of a prelude. The fugue is rather more nicely done. Stravinsky sets out a fugue in 3 voices for 3 clarinets. It's very jolly, a very un-Bachian sound. His only oversight, and it's an oversight he tended to make throughout his life, was running off the range of the instruments available. So although it says 3 clarinets, the lowest clarinet part goes way off what the clarinet can actually manage. So here is a case where the editor, all Stravinsky's life, stepped in and said, I'll tidy this up for you. What you need there is not a clarinet, but a bass clarinet. And then you get this terrific sound for a 3-part fugue. Thank you. think it's great fun to bring that to life. If one hadn't pursued it, found it, scored it up, edited it, advised on the bass clarinet, and then got it performed, you wouldn't have the fun of hearing that. And I think that makes the editing process exciting. There are many more instances of this sort of thing, and I'll mention some as I go along. The type of editing, though, that you can impose, if you like, on the original source, many choices. You could, for instance, just make a photographic facsimile. That would give you exactly what the composer wrote. But as you can see from this page of Stravinsky, there are going to be instances where it doesn't get you very far, although it's very nice and romantic to look at the composer's own shaky hand. It doesn't lead you that far along the line. You can then go for an edited version where the editor has sorted out the original notation, reproduced it more cleanly, more fully, more with instructions or at least advice on what it all means, but adding not another person's view of how it should sound, but merely trying to clarify your view of what is there. If, and this is a very typical 19th century attitude to editing, if the person doing the editing has a strong reputation or facility as a performer or teacher or conductor, what the public would probably like to see, they argued, was not the bare text as, say, Bach had left it, but what Joachim or Kreisler or Stokowski or anybody else would care to do with it. Therefore, the copy of the music that Stravinsky, for example, was working from was his edition of the Bach Well-Tempered Clavier that he put up on the piano and played every day as the bread of life. But it had been worked over by Carl Czerny in the 19th century, giving it fingerings, dynamic markings. Of course, Bach had not anticipated the dynamic capacity of the piano, nor the pedal markings, nor the rallentandos and crescendos and diminuendos, all the expressive things that go with the piano and were not part and parcel of Baroque notation. These very personal interpretations, of course, it was exactly what Czerny wanted to have shown on the page and to help his pupils. Other people might make a different choice. But this interpretative edition was then overlaid with the teacher's recommendations. And this is still very common. I think if you look at a lot of familiar pieces that conservatoire students will be playing, it seems to be more prevalent possibly in the area of string repertoire than other repertoire, but certainly romantic music tends to have hidden in it, usually within brackets, edited by, fingered by, expressive markings by. It's good that they should admit to them being there, but it is very rarely possible to distinguish, you know, is this fortissimo a Bach idea, or is it Mr. Czerny's idea, or is it some other editor, unnamed? How has it got into this music, and do we have an option of ignoring it? So you need to go back a little bit to the old principles of literary criticism, literary editing, or biblical editing, all those words that used to mystify me in the King James Bible when I was small, wondering why they were printed in italics. It only afterwards was explained to me that those were what the translators put in to show where they had had to add a word to make good an implication or fill out a phrase that was not similarly complete in the original language. And they admitted up to every addition they had put in there. You can't make sense of it without these, but at least it was very honorable that they showed what was the word of God and what was the additional word of the editor. But that sort of honesty then had a strong effect on the musicological world, and towards the 20th century there was invented this not very good term called the Autotext Addition, the original text, the true text, the basic text. It's what is shorthand nowadays for what I would prefer to call a critical edition. Urtext, meaning the single true text, is something you can very rarely establish. If you only have one source of a work, and there are no contradictory editions or printings, if there's no commentary necessary, if every note is absolutely clear, if every slur and every dot is exactly where it should be, then you could, of course, reproduce that and say that is the urtext. We are doing nothing to it because you have no choice what to do with it. But in most cases, you will have a manuscript that poses problems. If you look at maybe the middle pages of this handout, you'll see a little example of Mendelssohn presenting some problems, despite his calligraphy being very fine. His what he termed Revisionskrankheit, his mania for revising and adapting and crossing out, reaches a fine pitch here. We'll hear some of this music later, but clearly there are comments to be made on this, and you need to compare his manuscript with a printed edition. Often composers will make changes to their works as they go into print. If you're Brahms, you make changes to your works even when they're in print. In his library, when you look at his copy of his own printed works, he's made adaptations for them. They never got out to the public. They're very handy for a modern editor to look at and incorporate in a new edition, but he was happy to have made the correction on top of something that was already public. The ideal edition, I think, that you pick up should really not have all the answers to the problems that might be on the page, but it should in some way control the questions so that users can feel themselves they're in possession of the best available knowledge about this music. It does fall to the performer to make a lot of decisions, but they need to be informed decisions, and this is where the library side of things can help the non-library side, the performer. Editions can do a lot of things on your behalf. As I say, you can have editions which add to the basic music things that the composer might have expected you to know, or that a later interpreter thinks any performer should know. So Czerny and Kreisler, I've already mentioned. If you look at the front page of the handout, now this engraved page of a sonata, what we have here is a very early example, an 18th century example of the publisher's attempt to aid the performer. What you've got is a Corelli sonata. The lowest of the three staves in each system is the bass line, the continuo part. The middle stave is how Corelli wrote his violin sonatas. So you see there's certain economy of notes on that middle stave. It's very simple. Even if you don't read music much, you can see there isn't much there to read. On the top stave, though, is the part that Corelli did not write out, but the part that the public were desperate to know about. That is, when he played his music, and when any Italian played their solo music in the 18th century, it was normal practice to embellish it. You could embellish it with small trills, big trills, long flourishes, big cadenzas. Here, what you see on the top line is actually what the publisher first published, with a little rubric saying the ornaments to this edition as Mr. Corelli played them. Well, this was Corelli's own lifetime, so there may have been people around who said, wait a minute, Corelli never wrote this down. It looks a bit like something we've heard pupils of Corelli doing or something like that, but we don't have a Corellian autograph for this. So now one needs to be a little bit more circumspect about it, and the publisher ditto. Clearly in response to some criticism, the next issue of this edition came out. The rubric had been slightly changed, saying the violin sonatas of Arcangelo Corelli, Opus 5, containing the ornaments as he would like them played, which was a fine way of getting round the Trade Descriptions Act. And it is true, they can be measured against other people who wrote out typical Italianate embellishments to Corelli. There are many sets of these, all of them, of course, giving you the message that the one thing you cannot do is play this basic, simple part underneath. That was just the skeleton for what was going on. But it was not the expected way of performing it, whether or not you believe this is Corelli or friend of Corelli or some hack in the publisher's house. They are certainly nice ornaments. They agree with other ornaments that circulated by leading violinists, all showing a fair lavishness. You obey more or less the skeleton outline of the original notation, but you certainly dress it up with a lot of foliage, running scales up and down, and this clearly baffled people. They weren't quite sure how to do it. Here suddenly you had a set of sonatas with all the slower movements decorated in this way for your edification, and what you learned of this edition you could then apply to other Italian sonatas. So in a way this is an early form of the interpretative edition, and we mustn't credit it wholeheartedly to Corelli, but it is one of our most useful sources for knowing how to perform an 18th century, early 18th century Italian violin sonata. Other music contains similar mystifications, I think, for the performers. If you ever play French 18th century keyboard music, you'll know it's riddled with small ornamental signs looking very mysterious, and somewhere in the volume will be a table of these mystery signs and their explanation in written out notes. Well, to save you constantly turning to the front or back of your volume to discover what the little ornament means, some editors decided it was best to write out all these embellishments in a full flurry of notes. It's a little bit fussy and very busy on the eye. You get something looking like this decorated version of Corelli, but all the problems are solved for you. Ditto when you play early English virginalists' music. They had ornamental signs, the tail of the note with a stroke or with 2 strokes or sometimes even 3 strokes, meaning who knows what. But it's a mystery subject still. But editors decided to take it on themselves to translate these signs into something that we would understand. Of course, no conservatoire student will know what 2 strokes through a note means. But if you think it should be a trill, then you take away the 2 strokes and you put trill over the top. That is fine, so long as you admit to doing it. Sometimes this wasn't so, and therefore the wrong idea goes out that the virginalist music was full of trills looking very much like a Mozart piece, trilling on many notes. Be careful that your edition actually tells you who has done what. You can have also editions that explain things sometimes wrongly and become the current norm. One rather embarrassing one, I think, even I have to admit, is the Handel's water music. Somewhere in the 1950s grew up the idea that lovely bunch of pieces with different orchestrations that Handel wrote for performance on the river to mollify the king, that somehow that edition had got corrupted, and that the music you heard in this constantly changing orchestration should in fact have been 3 suites of music. And I think you will very frequently find it described now when you buy recordings of it, and even when you buy recordings I've made of it. We were in the period when we trusted this musicology that said there was hidden in there 1 suite involving trumpets, so it was called suite number 1, the trumpet suite. Suite number 2 was that involving the French horns, and then as a little apology at the end came the other movements, which tended to have flute and recorder and small-scale things, and so that was described as suite number 3 for flute. And then a theory grew up that suite number 1 was played loudly on the river as they went up to Chelsea, to Chiswick, and suite number 3, the small one, was played while they had their supper indoors, and the suite with number 2 with trumpets was played loudly as they returned. Well, there was immediately a problem with this theory, although it seemed to look very tidy and neat, and everybody loves to be told something was corrupted by hands unknown and we can put it right again. The accounts of the trip upriver said that there was a mixed band of instruments including flutes, recorders, oboes, trumpets and horns on the music barge, and they played continuously for 1 hour going upriver, And after supper, they played continuously for 1 hour, returning into London at 2 a.m. Must have annoyed some of the riverbank dwellers, I suspect. Then, in the Royal Society of Musicians, when we were rummaging in a bottom drawer a few years ago, turned up the earliest manuscript score of Handels Fireworks music. And it confirmed that the old mixed-up sequence of pieces was exactly what had been used in the early 18th century, and it confirmed this corrupted sequence of mixed-up music, and that was Handel's first intention. Musicology had got it wrong, and now we had to jumble all these pieces back into their old sequence, where you had a piece for horns, and then the trumpets played, and then the flutes played, and then again the trumpets came up. It was much loved, of course, by the brass players, who loved to have time off as well as time on for playing. And the whole thing becomes a really wonderful, unique example of continuously changing entertainment music from the 18th century, running for 1 hour. There's no other music, not even ballet scores I can think of from the 18th century, that are so continuously through composed with this varying orchestration. It's a very nice, brilliant idea of the young Handel, and it's unfortunate, I think, that we were just a little bit too clever at believing that the suites had got mixed. There wasn't an idea of having suites, there was an idea of having a kaleidoscope of ravishing music. That's actually, when you play it in sequence like that, it lasts 1 hour. So he got that right as well. So that sort of thing is to beware of. Musicology can sometimes overstep itself and make deductions on your behalf that may not be upheld. You can also, of course, have an edition that you rely on to decipher what was originally there. If you look at any Beethoven manuscript, you'll wonder how any engraver or editor made head or tail of some of those squiggles on the page, exactly as you might worry a little bit about the Stravinsky on the example you have, and how much puzzling you have to do to work out what is there. If you deal with composers like Walton or Vaughan Williams, there are still with us editors who worked with those composers, saying very often things were a complete muddle, and when you asked Vaughan Williams, was this line for clarinet in C or clarinet in B flat, he would say to the editor, well, I don't know, what do you think sounds best? Quite a lot of important decisions had to be made by somebody in the process of deciphering and resolving what the composer had given. There are always going to be discrepancies of what the handwriting actually means, because however clearly you indicate things, you'll find in all composers' manuscripts a little doubt as to how far that slur went. Did it cover 3 notes or 2 notes? Did the staccato mean a dot or a dash? When you're writing with a quill, it's very easy to make the one thing, a dash, and a dot, look more or less the same. Great puzzling for the editor of working that out. You can also have editions that clean up the act. That is where the notation is actually inaccurate or approximate or makes no sense to us nowadays. Remember, of course, that this slur we're talking about over a number of notes, it nowadays means to most players, on a string instrument it's very legato in one bow, on a piano you play smoothly, on a wind instrument you play in one breath. It can also mean a lot of other things. In the 18th century, it could mean that you played without adapting the rhythm of those notes. That is, you play them straight instead of swung. It could imply that you held all the notes down on a keyboard. There are, in the end, 12 different meanings for a slur circulating in the 18th century. An edition has to clarify that a little bit, I think. There were also conventions that existed right through the 19th century, when you have music that is in separate parts and in score. Brahms, for example, writes to his editors and engravers saying it's perfectly okay to put more information into the player's parts than you find in the score. So while everybody looks at, say, the Brahms sextets in the score, they see one set of instructions, but any player who plays from an individual part will see a completely different, sometimes completely different set of instructions, and certainly more instructions. A modern editor, I think, would say now that we deserve to have this evidence pooled and put into the score. This was not Brahms's intention even into the 1890s, that he was perfectly happy to see that the players had more detailed information than was facing them in the score. The same applied to orchestral music. So pity the poor conductor who keeps, looks at his score and says to the flute, "Why are you playing a sforzando there? Why are you playing staccato there? It's not in the music." And of course the flute turns back and says, "Oh, maestro, but it is in the music. It's in my part." And somehow you have to reconcile these concepts of whether or not the score should indicate everything that everybody has and show you the complete picture. In some cases, needing to resolve the complete picture if the evidence is contradictory. That tends to be the present idea. In the process of doing this, of course, you tend towards an edition which is labeled, as I said, urtext, meaning the true text. But it's a wrong description. It would more correctly be critical in two senses. One, that you can undo what the editor has done. That is, if the editor thinks something is wrong in the text and wants to amend it, add to it, or even subtract to it, he must give written acknowledgement of this fact. It's done usually typographically, as the biblical translators used italics to show what they'd added in the King James Bible. So the editor tends to use dotted lines or puts markings into square brackets, or at very least gives you at the back of the edition this very useful but in very thorny looking thing, the critical apparatus, the critical commentary, which looks like a slightly overgrown knitting pattern, where you get references to bars and parts and notes and sources when there are a number of different sources to a line. And so a typical line will say, clarinet, bar 6, note 7, staccato in source A and B, illegible in source C, staccatissimo in source D, missing in composer's autograph, or something like that. And by the time you've sorted all this out, you can, in fact, retrack through all the levels of evidence and get back to what they all said. It's quite hard work, but it should give you that sort of ability. And so that critical edition, I think, is what allows you to reverse the process and to make your own decisions. So it answers up to my first definition of what a good edition might be, that it can't answer all the questions, but it has to make you aware of the situation and give you the facility to make your own deductions from from the whole range of what is available on this. And one thing I would always say is that you should never trust the last version from the composer. We find many instances where you say, well, this is the final word. This is the composer's actual autograph. It tells us exactly what he wanted. We will follow it to a T. Only, unfortunately, somebody comes along and says, oh, no, when he got the proofs back from the printer, he made a lot of changes, you know. You have to look at the proof copy. And so it can go on. Even through pupils nowadays, very interestingly, those of you who heard a little snippet of Copland recording in one of my previous lectures will remember that there's Copland playing one of his most famous pieces, Appalachian Spring, and when the orchestra does not make a crescendo on a certain note, he says, where's that crescendo? And they say, Maestro, there isn't a crescendo. Oh, I don't know where it came from, but I like it. That, to me, constitutes something as good as written evidence. Copland wanted it, asked for it in rehearsal, and fixed it in his recording. That crescendo can then go back into the score, but indicated differently from the crescendos he actually wrote, being one that he dreamed he'd written but never had but asked for. And if you want to explain it in the critical notes, you can. In the process of pulling these pieces together, particularly if you're doing editing of a number of pieces by a composer, it falls on the editor, of course, to decide whether or not they're real. So you can have an edition which authenticates. I came across this when we were putting together everything that should, in our view, be published under a title saying Purcell Complete Keyboard Music. Well, if you're very scrupulous, of course, and many big editions are very scrupulous, the definition of a Purcell keyboard piece has to be one that is written by Purcell, signed by Purcell, or is indisputably got his name on that piece. Well, you would have very few pieces. If it's published with his name on the cover, you're pretty safe. But most music in the 17th century would have circulated in manuscript. A lot of Purcell's keyboard music is actually keyboard versions of things which exist in other forms and other scorings. I would be for a slightly more liberal view of taking everything that fulfills what I would describe as the young miss at the spinet test. That is, if you hear a young lady in the 17th century playing a piece of music and you say, "My dear, what's that you're playing?" She'll say, "Oh, it's Purcell." And you say, "Fine." She won't say, "Ah, it's a string piece from theatre music written in 1673, adapted by hands unknown for the keyboard, and therefore I cannot tell you honestly that it is Purcell." To anybody of the time, if it was music by Purcell in a keyboard form, you didn't query how it had reached that form. So, in that way, you can get a lot of lovely music. The more scrupulous administrators, of course, say, no, no, this is too broad. We cannot have this in an edition which is supposed to be urtext and pure. I was a bit disappointed by that, but one lucky thing happened. The only Purcell autograph of keyboard music turned up. It was bought by the British Library, where you can see it now. It's the only thing we have actually in his handwriting with his name on the pieces. And luckily, out of the something like 40 or 50 pieces I would like to see in such an edition that don't have his autographed name on them, but are Purcell's music nicely adapted, luckily, quite a few of them were in this autograph collection, including this one. You can hear the sort of music you might otherwise have missed. Hello. Nice little piece. Be a pity not to have it. Be a pity not to publish it. Shame not to play it. And luckily, with that discovery, there was suddenly a once bitten, twice shy attitude, and everything was available. You could put the whole lot in. So now the new edition of Purcell is going to have some, instead of, I think, 43 pieces, it's going to have 127 pieces. And you can romp around amongst them, and the critical commentary and everything around will tell you what the chances are of it being 100% Purcell or only 99% Purcell. The editor has another responsibility, I think, which is sometimes to show what I would call the process of composition. This goes a bit beyond the critical edition, in that you expand your brief to show what stages a piece went through in composition. And as you can see on these middle 2 pages of your music handout, this piece, which is Mendelssohn's Reformation Symphony, has quite a turbulent little life. It was written to celebrate, of course, the Reformation and the Augsburg Convention, and it was a ceremonial piece included in ceremonies with speeches, and it was not designed specifically to be a concert piece. But it was to do, of course, with Martin Luther, and the most famous chorale, Ein fester Burg, that Mendelssohn picked on was the signature tune of the Reformed Church. That became part of his brief. He included it as the main theme of the last movement of the symphony. And what you hear, well, let's play what you hear in the symphony as he eventually fixed it up, which is the version you see here, but with things crossed out. Let's just hear it with the as he presented it eventually in the version that you know, starting a little bit back in the slow movement, and then it proceeds into the finale where the flute discovers this chorale tune. This is the top line of what you have on your page. You notice that it went somewhere else at the bottom of that page, and that's the result of Mendelssohn's Revisionskrankheit, and cutting out what, when you look at the manuscript, turns out to be a completely scored up movement. If you turn to the next page, you'll see, although there's a big cross through it, everything is there, the expression. It was performed, in fact. It was only later he decided to shorten the piece. Why? He doesn't tell us, but I can immediately think of two good reasons. One is, as I say, this was a ceremonial piece. It had to fit within an evening of speechifying, celebrating sometimes church service, not a concert piece. It perhaps was too long for the occasion, and here was a nice way of taking a tuck. But symbolically, I think what he originally had in mind was much more interesting, which was, instead of the flute suddenly plunging in with that well-known chorale, a safe stronghold, out of nothing, there was this tradition that Martin Luther played the flute. So what you're seeing, I think, is the idea that Luther, in an idle moment, as well as writing the articles and a lot of other stuff, was doodling in the process of establishing some chorale melodies for this religious sect. And you follow the flute through a little recitative, and the orchestra joins, and the flute gets more excited and experiments with new things. And at the end of this recitative, which is the stuff that was crossed out here, you find you have arrived, after a little cadenza, at the theme, the end. It gives you a different picture, and I think a rather nicer and more programmatic effect of Luther coming to the conclusion of this is a good tune to try after a number of false starts. So, for an edition that I would call a process edition, what you can do is include this movement, so you now have the possibility to play it, and give instructions for, if people would like to see a sample of how this turns out in print. That can pass around. Okay. In printed form, and you just read the instructions. If you want Mendelssohn's last version, then you follow the system of dots, and you get what you just heard. If you want his earlier version, which is longer and has a second problem, I think, in Mendelssohn's mind, but maybe not in our mind, he hated being under the shadow of Beethoven, like many people did. And clearly somebody could easily say to him, aha, nice symphony you wrote, but haven't we heard that recipe before of a sort of solo, a recitative section before a finale? Isn't it Beethoven 9? You know, and so removing this evidence of the preliminary recitative, I think, spoils the piece, but removes the shadow of Beethoven. Anyway, here's as a final example. Here is it if you decide to put back what Mendelssohn decided to chop out. I think in terms of an editor's possibilities, it's absolutely the right thing to offer it with the information that you require if you decide not to play it. Thank you. Again, from the same place in the slow movement. So you see the effect. Okay, we're back into the finale where we left the other one, and it develops in exactly the same way. I like that little interlude, and obviously all flute players love it as well. So to make it available, I think, is something I would put in the yes category if you are dealing in terms of this new idea of the process edition. Next month, we'll go on from the edition process or otherwise and see what the performer makes of all this, which is the test of whether the editor has actually got it right. For the moment, though, it is questions from you, I suspect.
Well, thank you very much indeed. As usual, Professor Hogwood has agreed to answer questions. We've got about 6 minutes for questions, and the roving microphone is on its way. Can I ask you a question if no one else is going to?
Yeah.
With more recent times, of course, most composers now are writing directly to computers, so we're going to miss out on all of these interim periods.
You don't have to miss out, because there are facilities for people depositing preliminary drafts of things, as there are for novelists presenting their preliminary drafts and typescripts and things. Early, you rip off a disk from your computer when you've just had the inspiration. Log it somewhere. I forget where the place is for musicians, but they certainly exist in most countries, and they save it for you. And so later researchers can go over your old files. I always wonder what they'll find in these files in addition to the music that's there. But I think it is important, yes. It's like the problem facing all biographers now, that if everything is done by telephone, what is there left for the biographer to quote when writing up somebody's life? Yes, keep even the jottings, because I think more and more as we look at the evidence of these works, the process becomes as important really as the finished product.
Right on the front here, Anthony, sorry. Lawrence, it's a long journey down, but you're a fit young man, so that's fine. Anthony.
Yes, I'm interested in the extent to which dynamics in, for example, Schubert's music, and Schubert winterized in particular, which you might find in an edited edition, are actually genuine. Did Schubert write lots of dynamics and hairpins and things like that, or would these be more the editor's thoughts, or perhaps the result of an early performance?
Question of Schubert's markings. On the whole, Schubert marked things pretty well, and he did put dynamics and accents and so forth. There have been 1 or 2 editions which have gone beyond what he marked, but I think it's not hard nowadays to buy a so-called Autotext edition of Schubert that gives you only what his manuscript shows you. Certainly for Winterreise you can also buy a facsimile and check it out for yourself. The problem there comes in this area that I was mentioning of information you need to give to the performer, because Schubert had a particular quirk about writing accents. Well, a lot of composers did at his time, where instead of an accent being a little jab like that and a small V shape on its own, it was quite a long V shape, meaning a long drawn out accent over a bar or a phrase. And it was usually drawn at an angle up like that, not on the horizontal, but going from bottom left to top right. And most engravers, of course, don't like that sort of thing. And so it became engraved like that, looking like a diminuendo. So, in fact, at the end of the Schubert quintet, for example, you end with these big chords and then this extremely disappointing long diminuendo on the last chord, which was nothing of the sort. It was Schubert's extremely big accent that he put there, exactly the opposite effect of how people misinterpret it now. So that's a case where the text is pretty good for reproduction as it stands, but the interpretation of the text needs an editorial note or some explanation that you have to reinterpret these. Or the other way around is you just print it as an accent as we would expect it and show in a facsimile that Schubert's was a more long drawn out affair. I frankly like the graphic evidence of that long drawn out accent, but you do definitely need a footnote on the page saying this is not a diminuendo. But that's a very good case of, people feel they're safe with Schubert, but yet there are pitfalls where a good editor, I think, needs to help them over some of these translation points.
Well, I'm afraid we've reached 2 o'clock. Well, thank you very much for taking us from the composer's mind to his hand to the printed page in numerous steps here. The next stage, of course, is to take it from the printed version, as you say, to the performance. And in a month's time, on the 19th of April, you'll be joined by Dame Emma Kirkby, who knows as much of putting music to the music to the performance anybody else, and she'll be using the lute, I believe, as
Yes.
one of the examples here. But until then, well, thank you very much indeed once again for an absolutely superb lecture, which we've all enjoyed and learnt a lot from. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very nice.